What is a good MES? So I think if we're going to talk about good, setting aside the fact that I've had a career in software and related services, I think digital MES solutions that eliminate management by walking around and that eliminate, standalone use of things like Word documents and Excel spreadsheets, a properly integrated database-backed event-driven MES probably offers some advantages that those other things don't. And frankly, that trying to bend an ERP system or some other types of systems out of shape, don't offer you. So I think the types of advantages that come out of that come in several areas. One of which is objectivity, especially in a scenario where your machines can tell you a lot, but where you, up to a certain point, lacked a backbone to bring all of the things that they could tell you into a coherent story that follows each order, that follows each product, and that ideally can also follow those things as categories or representatives of categories. Because a machine won't tell you that it worked a perfect 8-hour shift with 2 15-minute breaks and just a half an hour for lunch. A machine won't tell you that it perfectly achieved its target of X number of units or X volume of product over a given period if it didn't. At worst, a machine may confuse you if it doesn't have a pre-programmed set of ways of describing the events that happen within it in ways that easily translate to human language in the way that we try to manage an operation. But usually there's enough there that we can build around it to get some picture of objective and accurate truth about a lot of what's been going on in the manufacturing operation. And then it's a question of how we tie the parts that are human-driven to that to flesh out that picture of objective and accurate truth. The second thing that a digital solution, properly structured, give you is a high degree of correlatability. And yep, for the pedantic people in the audience, we're going to invent a few words and live with them. And what I mean by that is, if you think about that business of making product, knowing what you want to make, you probably have a piece of that picture somewhere. It may or may not have been fully fleshed out. So you may have a simple bill of materials in your ERP system, but not one that necessarily describes how those materials are used at an operational stage. So it may not have complete or flexibly defined routings. You might have some elements in a CAD or CAM machine if you're running machine tools or machine cells that provide a certain amount of information that's useful to determine what parameters you might monitor for that are quality critical, but that probably isn't going to contain information about particular raw material grades or other information that you would want to use as feedstock into a particular unit for a particular product. And so if we think of correlatability, it's that having that backbone that says, if I know what I wanted to make, when I wanted to make it, what should have gone into it, and what the conditions should have been, a good MES will actually give you a record of that in ways that open up each of those dimensions for being ways that you can either summarize or investigate the information that's accumulated, not only within itself, but as signposts to investigate information from related systems that were either inputs to or interacting with the MES itself. And I think the other thing that comes from that correlatability is the capacity to then support other types of business initiatives in ways that may have been solved imperfectly because people were trying to work around the factory as if it was a black box. So we think about things like sustainability measures, where as we get deeper and deeper into formal carbon reporting or energy reduction or input reduction initiatives, we've gone from it being okay to report and analyze at an aggregate level to a world where more and more we need to understand what's my footprint on not just today, but this batch, this particular order, this particular mix of finished goods. And we want that information, not just for carbon trading or cap and trade or pure compliance reporting. We want that so we can know whether or not there's ways to make those numbers better, because that potentially reflects a cost savings. Thinking more creatively, if I've got an opportunity to use transparency as a competitive weapon in the marketplace, to show consumers something about the way I make my product or the materials that go into it that allow them to trust me more than the person next door. In the old world, we might have tried to just make broad statements about where we source materials. In a new world where I've got high levels of correlatability through my manufacturing process, I can do things like be the potato crisp manufacturer that lets you scan a barcode on a bag of potato chips or crisps, and from that launch a website that tells you a bit about the farm where they were grown, the farmer that raises them, information about that batch of potatoes as they came in for processing and being turned into my favorite snack. And again, really hard to do that with pure paper, really hard to do that without something that acts as a backbone, not just for what's happening within the factory, but for the things that feed into the planning, the coordination, and the execution of production. And another thing that comes out of having this as a proper backbone kind of system is a high degree of portability of data. And I mean that in a few ways. You might think of it partly as being able to bundle up information about a particular batch of produced goods and share that. So if I'm providing materials as an input to a brand owner or to a subsequent manufacturer, it may be that things that I can tell them not just about my product's characteristics, but the conditions under which it was processed will affect their ability to make best use of that good. It could be something as straightforward as being able to bundle up a record of quality and have that easily and readily available for a risk management firm that performs inspections on behalf of my customers or the government. But I also want to think about that portability not being about explicitly moving the data, but simply making it available in a way that's useful. So if I have a continuous improvement team that's trying to solve questions about throughput or downtime or quality losses, if all they've had so far are handwritten records where people sign off and say, yes, I looked at the dials on the machine and they looked fine to me and here's my initials to validate that, that's not terribly useful if what you're trying to figure out is whether there's a pattern of behavior within a process or whether the characteristics of a material or ingredient or a part affect the behavior of a machine, because handwriting doesn't really lend itself to database queries, trending, and reporting. So when I say portable, it's not literally picking up and moving data necessarily, but it does mean making the data available for some sort of access for people to support some kind of investigation or view that isn't necessarily just about the minute-by-minute execution of a production order and the making of a product. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why kind of reintroducing this from the grounds up seemed like not a bad idea. And to be honest, it's partly because as an individual, I've observed that over the last few years in particular, people in my shoes, delivering the services, recommending technologies, as a group, we've fallen into some traps. And I think it's probably coming from a good place because what we've tried to do is to create ways of communicating about this type of function set in the way it fits in an organization. But because we tend to be technology people, we've had this really bad habit of taking things like the original MESA model, which defined operations descriptively, and the point of it was to illustrate the work processes of manufacturing in a terminology and at a level of detail that would allow people to say, oh, now that I understand this as a business capability, I can think about ways to systematize it. And in fact, the first iteration of the ISA 95 model was again released as a descriptive model. But we technology people have a bad habit of looking at anything with the word model attached and we want to turn it into things like a database model or something that can be algorithmically driven. So part of our challenge that we've introduced on ourselves is we've treated things that were descriptive models as if they were prescriptive models for things like what should the database design under the bonnet of an MES look like. And that's actually taken an awful lot of focus away from the question of, if these are the capabilities that define able to make, what's already well supported and what's the capability set that I need from tools to supplement things I may already own and to integrate, not get sidetracked into purist discussions about the exact structure under the bonnet of one particular software package or another. And I think compounding that, we've also taken things that stood as a handy, quick reference for common practice and held them up again as if they're prescriptive. So many of you probably have seen pyramid-style diagrams over the years that reference the Purdue model and even an overlapping of the Purdue model and the ISA 95 model as we talk about, level 0 systems for sensing and level 1 for control and level 2 for SCADA and level 3 for MES and level 4 for ERP and related. And of course, as cloud comes along, we add level 5 or 3.5 or whatever seems to make sense depending on the vendor's buzzwords. And again, if we think about what that model was really supposed to represent, the pyramid wasn't to say, you must have this or you should do this. It was intended to be a snapshot of a common system stack and to illustrate why certain things tended to exist the way that they did at a particular, or I guess throughout a particular window of time. But if you take the technologists, especially the technology enthusiasts' tendency to want to turn a good idea into a formula, you can see how we may have taken things that were intended to help understand the universe and instead tried to turn them into a prescriptive technical formula for building systems, deploying systems, and integrating systems. And the trouble with that is, it means that the people who own the P&L, who own the responsibility for making sure that the manufacturing operation is running well, feel like, oh, this is a technology question, not an operations enablement question. And that's probably one of the worst traps that we technologists can create, is one where we've lost the attention and the interest and the input of the people that we're doing this work for in the first place. So through the rest of this series, through a little bit of video, some written bits here and there, and a few other means, what we're gonna do is follow up on this basic reset and then speak through a few things that we think are useful as an overall collective toolkit for a mix of technology and non-technology people navigating the question of what tools will help me be a better manufacturer. So you'll find that we will follow this with an exploration of the systems landscape. As I've said before, MESs is really something that should be thought of as a collection of capabilities. It doesn't matter whether some of those capabilities come from what we might call an ERP or what we might call a CAD/CAM or a PLM system. The trick is to have a map that says, if I need X and Y and Z, and I already get X and Z from things that exist, what I need is Y to live between, interact with, and fill its piece. So we'll talk a little bit about the landscape. We'll zoom in a little bit, I shouldn't even say a little bit, we'll actually take a fairly deep dive into what it takes organizationally to organize to be an effective buyer, owner, and steward of MES systems as well. Because I think too often, if we fall into the trap of thinking it as a technology project, we lose sight of the fact that business processes are why it's there. So we'll explore things like, how does being a good owner translate into an understanding of who needs to be in charge of what when we think about a process like launching a new product, or taking an adapted recipe and making sure that it's replicated out to all of the different places where I'm going to use that recipe. And I think probably the other key thing that we want to dig into is a question of ecosystem. There's no such thing as a set of capabilities that you can build fully on your own as a manufacturer, unless you're part of a very rare club that has maintained an incredibly strong internal applications IT group alongside an IT infrastructure group, as well as a very strong process engineering and maintenance engineering type team. So since it's the new normal for people to need to know how to construct an ecosystem of outside consultants potentially to help set a course, outside services firms for a mix of both technology, execution and implementation, but even in some cases technology selection and choice work, we'll want to give some useful guidance on how you can go about evaluating which are the right types of partners to bring into your ecosystem, and how to make sure that you as the manufacturer are still the one in control of the important decisions and know how to orchestrate or coordinate that community around yourself. So with this set as the intro, you can look forward to a few things that we hope will make life a little bit easier for anybody who is looking at modernizing or adopting for the first time modern tools to give them manufacturing execution capability.